Hello everyone, welcome to our program on race lighting. My name is Luke Wood and I'll be serving as one of your facilitators for this program. In this program, we're going to explore the concept of race lighting. And you might be asking yourself, well, what is race lighting? Well, think about it like this. Race lighting is what happens when gaslighting is racial. When your reality is distorted by another person, either with intention or without intent, that results in you starting to second guess yourself and feeling a sense of disorientation.
This will be a 5-part series that will delve into the concept of race lighting and how it serves to impact the lives and experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this nation. And we'll be looking across a number of different contexts in education, in policing, in healthcare, in the business sector, though many of our examples will draw from the field of education. As I mentioned, this series is broken up into 5 separate modules, and this first module is titled Introduction and Antecedents of Race Lighting. And in this module, we'll be talking about the factors and conditions that serve to create the race lighting experience for Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
And we have a few primary objectives for this program. First, we are going to define race lighting. We're going to talk about what it is, we're going to talk about the primary types of race lighting, and how ultimately it influences the lives and experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this country. The second is we're going to articulate and overview common racial microaggressions that serve to race light Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Now, microaggressions are messages which serve to insult and invalidate people of color. The accumulation of these messages over time can serve to make someone feel a sense of overwhelming doubt and disorientation. And so ultimately, we're going to look at the relationship between racial microaggressions and race lighting. The third thing that we're going to do is to describe how race lighting can be associated with other unhealthy outcomes. These unhealthy outcomes are manifold, but can include imposter syndrome, stereotype threat, and most importantly, racial battle fatigue, a concept that was created by our colleague and friend, Dr. William Smith from the University of Utah, and we're going to be talking about how race lighting and racial battle fatigue are linked in ways that serve to create a difficult experience in the lives of BIPOC. And then the fourth point that we're going to focus on throughout this program is strategies for addressing race lighting. We're going to look at what are some things that can be done at the personal level, what are some things that can be done at an institutional level, ultimately to create an environment where people, BIPOC, don't experience race lighting or that its effects are as limited as possible.
This program is supported by the College Futures Foundation, and we want to give them a special acknowledgement of gratitude for their support of this race lighting program and our ability to put it into modules and make it available to the public. In particular, we would like to recognize Sean Whalen for all the support he's had of our work since we began our center in 2011. With many of our presentations, we like to begin with this quote here from Asa Hilliard, because we think it serves to provide us with a foundation for the kind of framing and sense making we need to have when we think about work that is critical around race. And so Asa Hilliard, for those who are not aware of his work, was an Egyptologist and Africana studies scholar. He was a psychologist, he was an educator, and he spent his life looking at how Black students can be successful in school and understanding the role in Afrocentric principles and teaching philosophies and supporting that. And after years and years of doing research, he concluded with this statement saying, I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings. And the second thing you do is love them. And what he's getting at here is 2 primary concepts. First, treating individuals like human beings. We have to see the individuals who are at the other end of these race lighting experiences as full intact human beings. And we'll talk about the challenges in that in terms of the antecedents of race lighting. And second, when we're working with anyone, particularly in an educational context, our goal should be to convey authentic care, or as Asa Hilliard referred to it as love, to our students. What does that mean? It means that we have a shared or vested interest in their success, where if they succeed, if they hit the mark, if they get the grade they're looking for, the job, the internship, whatever it might be, that we are going to personally feel like we did well because we have this shared or vested interest in their success. But on the flip side, if they stumble, if they fall, if they miss the mark, if they don't get the job, the grade, or the internship that they're looking for, that we're going to personally feel like we did not do well because we have a shared or linked vested interest in their success. That is a concept that we talk about in terms of education, in terms of creating the conditions that can make it so a student can learn, grow, develop, and be successful. That is applicable to all levels of education, but it's also applicable to those who are engaged in customer service or nonprofit organizations that are working with certain communities that are their primary target communities. Ultimately, what we want to do is ensure that people know that we are engaged in this work for them with the right intentions. And so I think this serves to provide us with a framework for thinking about the Racelighting experience, because unfortunately, treatment of individuals as human beings and expression of authentic care is oftentimes not always extended to Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this nation. And one of the reasons for that is what we see on the left-hand side of your screen. Now, the figure that I'm going to present to you is a figure that myself and my colleague Frank Harris created on the Racelighting process, talking about what are the factors that serve to influence Racelighting, how does that relate to bias, how does that lead to microaggressions, how does that create a Racelighting experience, and then that serves, of course, as a doorway to negative psychosocial outcomes like racial battle fatigue, stereotype threat, and imposter syndrome, we'll talk about later. But beginning at the very beginning of this model, we want to focus on the antecedents. And these antecedents are factors that are specific to our life and culture across the world, but of course, within the context of the USA in which this presentation is taking. What are the antecedents within our society that serve to frame the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this nation? And they include white supremacy, white nationalism, white fragility, anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, and capitalistic interests. And these serve to create those conditions. And so let's explore some of these that are the most relevant to this particular conversation on those that are most directly related to Racelighting. And the first of those would be white supremacy. So white supremacy refers to the beliefs embodied within white culture that deem other races and people as less dignified and or worthy. So it's seeing a group that is different from you and perceiving them to be lesser than because of them being affiliated with this particular racial group. And more simply, it occurs when the white race sees itself as superior to other races. And so white supremacy, when people think about this concept, and many times in their minds, they have images of the KKK or other supremacist organizations. But we also know that white supremacy can be tacit, meaning that people can have ideas that align with white supremacy, but are not overtly white supremacist in nature, meaning they're not part of a particular organization like the KKK or a white supremacist overtly, but that you unconsciously tend to agree with some of these notions and principles. And as a result, it's evident in the work that you do. It's evident in your relationships with people. It's evident in everything because of the underlying element within the culture. Now, when white supremacy is mixed with this notion of nation statehood, it becomes white nationalism. And we can see the connection between certain elements of Americana and how they can have been infused with this notion of white culture as being more supreme. And when that linkage takes place of white supremacist values with those of the nation state, that becomes white nationalism. And we've seen the rise of white nationalism across our nation. And a perfect example of that was the insurrection at the Capitol that took place on January 6th. White fragility can then be a response to issues when there is racial conflict, where these notions of white supremacy and white nationalism are evident, and someone maybe, for example, brings that to someone's attention, and the response is a defense mechanism. So white fragility is when racial conflict triggers these defense mechanisms from white people to not be receptive to feedback and not be receptive to the idea that race and racism are prevalent in the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and that racism is an underlying element within American culture. And so white supremacy, white nationalism, white fragility are all concepts that are certainly relevant to a conversation on race sliding. But also, because we're focusing on race, we also have to recognize that racism in and of itself is a broad term, but does not fully capture the unique expressions of racism that can take place for certain communities. Many people have referred to anti-Blackness as its own pandemic because anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon. No matter where you go in the world, anti-Blackness is evident, whether it is in the UK or in Asia or in India. There are individuals who are from certain communities who are perceived as being Black, either based upon their skin or based upon their cultural identity. And as a result, they are more likely to be treated with disdain and more likely to be othered than other groups. And this is evident, again, across all different elements of the world or different aspects and parts of the world, but is certainly evident here in the United States. And we've seen the unique expression of this anti-Blackness that's been highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. So anti-Blackness manifests as a unique form of racism against Black people due to the permanent association of Black people with chattel slavery and subsequent views that they are lesser than. And so this notion of connection of Black people within the United States framework to chattel slavery rather than to their origins, our origins in Africa, is one that is a permanent association that creates a unique form of racism for Black people, according to Frank Wilderson. And so given the enslavement of Black peoples, segregation, the prison industrial complex, there's a unique historical relationship and framing between the relationship between Black people and non-Black people in this nation. And so we like to look at anti-Blackness through this lens as offered by DeMoss and Ross, where they said that anti-Blackness is an embodied lived experience of social suffering and resistance. And perhaps most importantly, as antagonism, and here's the key point, in which the Black is a despised thing in and of itself, in opposition to all that is pure, human, humane, and white. And so the Black is a despised thing in and of itself. So being Black in and of itself has a negative association with it, according to DeMoss and Ross, in this country, and that it has been juxtaposed through stereotypes, through white supremacy, through white nationalist ideas, as being in opposition to those elements of culture and those elements of society that are viewed as being pure, human, moral, white, or good. There is also similarly a unique relationship between anti-indigeneity and white supremacy as well. Similarly, the relationship between white people and Native peoples is grounded in generations of genocide. And prior to the contact with Europeans, there was an estimated 5 million Native Americans in the United States, a number that fell below 250,000 by the 1900s, according to Madley 2015. This genocide also coincided with boarding schools and voluntary relocation, such as the Trail of Tears, and destabilization of Native sovereignty by the federal government as intentional acts by the federal government. As a result, anti-Indigenous actions continue today, the exploitation and oppression of Native peoples through the continuation of settler colonialism and the settler colonialism mentality. And so we want to think about anti-indigeneity as being unique form of racism that faces Native people. And so on your screen is a definition for anti-indigeneity. And it says that the core of anti-indigeneity is an opposition to self-determination, political and cultural autonomy, and the right to maintain, use, and protect traditional territories and resources. But from clear hate groups to fellow travelers and opportunists, there's little to no scrutiny of anti-Indigenous ideologies anywhere on the planet. So the core of anti-Indigeneity is an opposition to self-determination, political, and cultural autonomy for Native peoples. Now, another important framing that we think is critical to understanding race sliding is that race sliding is a concept that fits within the context of conversations on equity.
So one of the things that we're going to focus on today is a concept called equity. Now, equity refers to a heightened focus on groups that experience disproportionate impact. DI, that's an important word. We're going to come back to that. In order to remediate disparities in their experiences and their outcomes. Notice that it doesn't say to remediate disparities in students, their families, or their communities, and our faculty and staff of color. No, that's not our focus here. Our focus is on remediating the disparities in their experiences and their outcomes, which is a function of the institution. What are we doing or not doing that's resulting in the outcome differences that we see? So we're focusing on remediating those disparities from an institutional responsibility perspective. Now, again, I use this word disproportionate impact. Again, equity refers to a heightened focus on disproportionate impact. So you might ask yourself, well, what is disproportionate impact? Well, let's say that we have outcomes that we're looking at for a particular group. We have groups that, let's say we're looking at satisfaction levels with campus climate based upon people who are within an institution. And we have these bars for all these different groups of individuals. Let's say that this represents our white community, our black community, our Latinx community, our Native community, our Asian community, and those who are declined to state. And this is looking at ultimately satisfaction, right? Their satisfaction with the campus environment. And so ultimately what we want to recognize is that there is a certain mean among this group. There's a certain average experience. And let's say that that average experience is somewhere right in here. And so what equity refers to is a heightened focus on these groups that have outcomes that are lower than that of their peers. And ultimately what we want to do, big bars here, big bars here, big bars here, little ones here and here, what we want to do is focus on how can we bring up the experiences of these groups in order to be able to ensure that their experiences and outcomes are higher than they are currently. So we're trying to address the disparities, the gaps here that we see, and these gaps here and here and here, those gaps represent disproportionate impact. Now, there are a lot of groups that may experience disproportionate impact. It can include our students of color, our Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color. It can include those who are current and former foster youth. It can include those who are lower income, our students, faculty, and staff who may have disabilities. It can include those who are part of the LGBTIAQ+ population. Ultimately, it's based upon data. So we don't make assumptions about which groups experience disproportionate impact and which groups don't. What we do is we look at outcomes data, whether that's persistence, achievement, attainment, transfer, feelings of welcomeness in the campus environment, a sense of belonging, a sense of mattering, all of these different things. And then we look to identify where those groups that we see these outcome gaps, and then that's where we intercede. That's where we focus. And I would almost paint the picture like this. Imagine that there's a building that's on fire. And the fire department comes and they're trying to figure out, what do we do? They don't start by spraying water on the whole building. They go to where the building is on fire and they start there. Now, they may have a team that also sprays water in other places to prevent spread, but they're focused specifically on where the intensity of that flame is. So too are we doing the same thing when it comes to disproportionate impact and being equity-minded. We are trying to identify these groups and we're trying to focus here because this is where the challenge is. But we also rationalize the challenges, again, not being a function of students, their families, or their communities. No, we see the function as a result of the institution itself. Again, asking ourselves, what are we doing or not doing that's resulting in the outcome disparities that we see? It reminds me of a quote from W. Edward Deming and Paul Batalden. Many of you have heard this quote before, but it really serves to paint the picture for what we're talking about. And it says that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. So if we see outcome disparities for certain student groups, that's not just by happenstance, that's not by accident, that's a function of a system that has been designed to produce those results. So if we want to change the outcome disparities that we see, then what do we have to change? You're right, the system.
Now, when we think about equity, we really think about it through the lens has been espoused by Dr. Estella Ben-Simone, in her concept of equity mindedness. So equity mindedness is when we take the concept of equity and we have it influence the ways in which we think about and engage the work that we do. So it's not enough to say that we have a focus on equity. Equity actually needs to influence the sense making that we have within our organization and within our decision making. So Dr. Ben-Simone says that equity mindedness really entails a focus on several key areas. One is recognizing how systemic inequities serve to disadvantage minoritized people in a range of social institutions or contexts. So first is a recognition that there are systemic inequities that are related to systems. And we are oftentimes informed by the work of W. Everett Deming and Paul Bataldo. And many of you have probably heard this quote by now, which says that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. So if we see outcome disparities for certain groups, we don't say, what is the student not doing that's resulting in this outcome disparity? We say, what is the systems that are in place that have produced this? And those systems are oftentimes a function of what we do or don't do as educators. And so we have a systems perspective. And so we recognize that there are also different systems. Education is a system, employment is a system, healthcare is a system, the criminal justice system is a system. And we also consider the fact that an inequity in one system can serve to amplify an inequity in another system. So case in point, if you have inequities in your employment, let's say that you are either unemployed or you are underemployed, that can have direct impacts on your inequities in healthcare, your access to quality healthcare, or you're having healthcare coverage at all. And so ultimately, we can see the relationship between employment and healthcare as being one that inequity in one system can amplify an inequity in another system. But probably the example that we're most familiar with is the relationship between education and the criminal justice system, oftentimes referred to as the school to prison pipeline, which suggests that overplacement in special education and overexposure to exclusionary discipline, suspensions, and expulsions, that those two things serve as the two pillars of that school to prison pipeline, where students are then more likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system and then subsequently in the criminal justice system. The second point is that we have to reframe outcome disparities. When we see outcome differences for certain groups, let's say that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have outcomes that are lower than that of their peers on some form of a performance measure, that is an indication of institutional underperformance, not students' underperformance. We don't go to blaming students, blaming their families, or blaming their communities. We look at the institution and say, what are we doing or not doing that's resulting in those outcome disparities? It's a focus on institutional underperformance rather than this blame game where we focus on the perceived deficits of others. So we don't want to attribute outcome disparities exclusively to students or perceived deficits in their identities, in their life circumstances, and their capabilities. We don't look out into the window into students' we don't look out the window into students' lives and their experiences and blame them. Instead, we look into the mirror to see what is it that we're doing that's contributing to this. And then we want to critically reflect upon our roles and responsibilities as educators, whether we're a faculty member, a staff member, administrator, a counselor, an institutional researcher, whatever our positionality might be, we have to critically reflect and ask ourselves, are we doing everything that we need to be doing, including holding one another accountable? If we know the individuals within our organizations who do not treat our students, faculty, or staff well, we have a responsibility to critically reflect upon that and to say something and do something and act. Because if we don't, then we're allowing harm to manifest within our environment. And that critical reflection should serve to lead to critical action on behalf of those who are minoritized within our organizations. Another key concept that we have to consider as part of the Racelighting experience is the role that bias has in this. And bias is a key point, a key element within our Racelighting model, where there is explicit bias and implicit bias, which serves to influence the experiences with microaggressions. The antecedents of Racelighting: white supremacy, white nationalism, white fragility, anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, and capitalistic interests, serve to create conditions for bias. And there's two different types of bias that we want to be attentive to: explicit bias and implicit bias. Explicit bias is explicit, meaning that it's conscious. Explicit biases are overt and intentional beliefs that negatively view, characterize, and engage others. So these are consciously held ideas that negatively view people who are different from us. Oftentimes, these biases are self-reported as being consciously held by the individuals, meaning that you have a bias that's consciously held and you know that you are holding this bias towards someone else. And so we want to talk about explicit bias because oftentimes conversations on bias immediately go to implicit bias because it's a conversation that's more comfortable because it's less conscious. But there are also individuals who have consciously held biases about people who are different from them. And we see examples of the manifestation of this in colleges and universities across the nation. One is the way in which we see this is through flyering that takes place on campuses across the country as a regular pattern each year. White supremacist organizations target colleges and universities with rhetoric and paraphernalia, like some of the examples that you see on your screen. In my line of work, I have seen nearly every single one of these flyers, and they communicate an ideology that fuels white supremacy and fuels white nationalism and tries to bring in individuals who may have less strong ideologies in order to be able to be part of these organizations. In addition to that, we see the manifestation of white nationalism, again, through the insurrection that took place at the Capitol on January 6th. And if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a shirt that one of the individuals is wearing. It says 6MWE, which refers to the notion that 6 million wasn't enough when it comes to the 6 million individuals from the Jewish community who lost their life during the Holocaust. And as you see these shirts with 6 million is not enough, and on the left-hand side, Camp Auschwitz, you can also see then American paraphernalia as well. Again, what happens when white supremacy and nation statehood emerge to become white nationalism. Now, one of the articles that we saw recently that we thought we would share with you is came out in USA Today, and it says, and the title of it was "Hate Groups Declined in 2021, but Fringe Ideology is a Powerful Force Shaping U.S. Politics," according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so in this paper and in this article, what they did is they reported on a study that the Southern Poverty Law Center did, which showed that the total number of hate groups had actually declined. But in the article, they provide a description as to why that occurred. They said the decline does not indicate that the far right's power is waning, but rather suggests that extremist ideas had moved from fringe groups to the political mainstream, meaning that you did not have to be part of a hate organization or hate entity or group to have a hate-filled ideology, because the notions of hate were so mainstream at this point that they're part of mainstream and common political conversation. In other words, you could just turn on the nightly news and hear the same kind of rhetoric that in before you may have had to be part of an organization to hear. And separate from the explicit bias, the overt and intentional bias, there's also implicit bias. And that's the bias, again, that individuals like to talk about more because it's more comfortable. It's the more beneath the surface bias. It's the bias where we oftentimes want to separate intent from impact, because with implicit bias, you can communicate a negative message both with intent, but oftentimes without intent. But even if you don't have a bad intent, because your actions are informed by bias, you can have a bad impact. And so we separate intent from impact. We also want to recognize that when it comes to implicit bias, being biased doesn't make you bad. It makes you human, because all of us have biases, every single one of us. However, once you're aware of the fact that you have bias and you choose not to do anything about it, that's what's bad. And so we want to focus on that in terms of this conversation. Now, on your screen, you see a definition and a description of implicit bias. We'll start with the one on the top from the Kirwan Institute, which says that implicit bias is the attitudes or stereotypes that affects our understanding, actions, and decisions in an implicit manner, activated involuntarily without awareness or intentional control. It can be either positive, We have biases that are positive, that see some groups as being more moral, of greater worth, inherently more intelligent, and other groups as negative, of lesser worth, less intelligence, less moral. And it says that everyone is susceptible. And notice it doesn't say that some people are susceptible or that most people are susceptible, but that everyone is susceptible. That includes you, that includes me, that includes others who might watch this program in the future. The second definition or description, I should say, of implicit bias comes to us from Greenwald and Banaji. And it says that implicit bias is characterized by the introspectively unidentified or incorrectly identified traces of past experience. We're going to come to that notion of traces of past experience, because that's where the messages come from, that mediate attributions of qualities to members of social categories. And so on your screen, you see this definition, this description, but there's some key points that we want to highlight here. First, when we want to think about implicit bias, we want to think about it as attitudes or stereotypes that we have. So stereotypes about individuals who are different from us. And those stereotypes are activated involuntarily, meaning that we're not aware of them. We're not necessarily intentionally conveying something. And what happens is that they're informed by our traces of past experiences, which are informed by traces really of these past stereotypes. And they ultimately motivate our actions and our decisions. So they impact what we do, how we engage everyone, and that all of us are susceptible to this bias. So implicit bias exists, it's a real thing, but we also know that there are certain times when we're more likely to convey bias than others. And from Kahneman and colleagues, and when I say colleagues, there's numerous others who have written about this, they oftentimes juxtapose when we're more likely to convey implicit bias to an individual or less likely based upon the types of thinking and processing that we have at the time, whether it's a system 1 type of thinking or a system 2 type of thinking. Now let's start with system 2, because this is when we're less likely to convey our biases to one another. So system 2 is when we are employing our conscious reasoning. So we're in a situation, we're engaging with someone, and we're being thoughtful about every word that comes out of our mouth. Our engagement with that individual is thoughtful. We're in the moment with them. It's controlled. As we think about every word, we're also noticing whether they're aware of our body language and our eye contact, if it's culturally appropriate to do so. So we're engaging in more complex thinking because we're trying to ensure what is within our minds and on our hearts is what is actually expressed to the other individual. And engaging in this way, it's more controlled, it's higher effort, and we're less prone to bias. But in reality, most of our lives, we are engaging in a system 1 type of thinking, particularly in a social setting, where we're responding in the moment as things are coming up in conversation and we're employing our unconscious reasoning. We're not being as thoughtful about every word. It's more automatic and it's more efficient, because what happens is our mind fills in the blanks with those traces of past experience, which again, we'll come back to. Doing so is lower effort, but it's also more prone to bias because I'm responding in the moment as things are coming up. It's less thoughtful, it's less complex, it's less effort, and it's more prone to bias. So system 1, system 2, and again, system 2 less likely to convey bias as system 1 more likely to convey bias. So then your next question might likely then be, well, when am I more likely to engage in a system 1 versus a system 2 thinking? And we're more likely to engage in a system 1 when we have 3 conditions that are in place. First, that we have incomplete information, I, T, when our time is constrained, and S, when we're experiencing stress or insufficient sleep. And according to Bertrand and colleagues, implicit associations are most likely to drive behavior under the following conditions. So incomplete information, so situations that involve ambiguous or incomplete information. So we're engaging with someone and we don't have the full to complete information about what the conversation is supposed to be about, what the decision is supposed to be about, or who they are as an individual. Our time is constrained, so we're in the moment, we're responding in the moment as things are coming up. And the nature of our thinking, our cognitive control is compromised because we're experiencing stress or insufficient sleep. So think about these 3 conditions. Your life and in your engaging with, in your life, you're engaging with someone, you have incomplete information, your time is constrained, and you're experiencing stress. For most of us, that represents our Monday, our Tuesday, our Wednesday, our Thursday, our Friday. It represents all of the different days of the week for us. And it is a common experience for us. It is a common experience in policing. And we can see then how implicit bias is a concept that is oftentimes talked about in concert with issues within law enforcement. So here's an example of that. You have a young Black male who is with his friends, and he has a toy gun. And he's outside with his friends, and a neighbor sees this and decides to call the police. They don't know whether the gun is real or whether the gun isn't real, but they decide that they want to inform law enforcement. So there's ambiguous or incomplete information that's passed on to law enforcement. Their time is constrained, so they get information from dispatch. They show up to a scene and they see a young Black boy, or a Black male, with what could be or could not be a gun. Their time is constrained. The nature of their job is one where that they experience stress and insufficient sleep. And that is how we get names such as Tamir Rice. Now, ultimately, the decision to pull or not pull a trigger is informed by bias. And that bias is oftentimes implicit bias. And so it speaks to the incredible point that we have to do a better job of training those who are engaging communities that are different from them, particularly those who are armed with deadly force, as we think about the role that bias has in our micro decision making, and ultimately can produce deadly results for those who are from Black and Native and Latinx communities. And so we see a lot of research on implicit bias in policing, but we also see a lot of research on implicit bias in schooling, because those same conditions are in place. You're in a classroom context. There's ambiguous or incomplete information about what just happened with a certain situation. The educator decides, let's say this is a K-12 classroom, that they see some boys. Are they pushing one another? Are they playing around? They decide to intercede immediately, and they kick one of the boys out of the class. Their time is constrained. The nature of that environment is stressful. And it's why we see excessive suspensions for young Black boys in comparison to their peers for actions and behaviors that are similar or lesser than, but are treated with a higher level of severity than their peers. The primacy effect is also another concept that is relevant here, and it goes back to what we mentioned before, which is those traces of past experience. Those traces of past experience. So when we have implicit bias, remember that we have a system one type of thinking, and we're processing information faster. We're responding in the moment as things are coming up. And as a result, we're more likely to convey those traces of past experience, that primacy effect. So what is the primacy effect? It refers to the fact that individuals tend to give more weight to information presented earlier when forming opinions and making decisions. It refers to the fact that individuals tend to give more weight to information presented earlier when forming opinions and making decisions. So in argumentation, for example, it is oftentimes said that the person to make the first argument has the strongest argument, because everything that comes after that is a counter argument responding to the initial claim or argument that was made. We see that in argumentation, but we also see this in socialization. Our earliest experiences with individuals who are different from us serve to shape how we think about them. And oftentimes if our experiences with people who are different from us are not direct experiences, but things that are informed by what we've seen on the news or in the media, oftentimes those are also then informed by biases. So if you grew up in early experience, you had a family member who said, as you're driving through a certain neighborhood, to roll up the window or to lock the door. Or if you got home at night and you turned on the nightly news and it said searching for Black male suspect, searching for Latino male suspect, searching for Black male suspect over and over again. And then you turned on the television and you saw that Black people and Native people were presented in certain ways when it comes to movies and film. Those early images serve to influence and shape the ways that you think about things. And so as you're pulling those traces of past experience, you're oftentimes and unintentionally conveying bias to one another, because our mind is serving to fill in those blanks. So far we have talked about the antecedents of Racelighting, and we've talked about explicit bias and implicit bias. In the next section, we will focus on racial microaggressions, because oftentimes racial microaggressions serve to communicate a race lighting experience to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we're going to explore what that looks like. So we will see you in the next session. Thank you.